Hey guys, it's Charles again with another segment in our attic mold video series. So today what we're going to talk about are the various types of techniques that are utilized in the industry for treating attic mold problems. So what we're going to do is we're just going to blow up our attic here. This triangle is going to be our attic space. And so what we've got are workers that are up in the attic. In many cases, they're going to be crawling on their hands and their knees. Bear with my little men. And what they're going to be doing is treating the attic wood. Well, there are several basic techniques that are used in this industry. And the first technique that is what I like to call the spray and spray paint technique. So we'll go ahead and write that down. So in the spray and spray paint technique, what's going to happen is our little guy is going to come up in there and he's going to take a fog pot and he is going to apply atomized biocide to the wood. Well, what's a biocide? A biocide is anything that kills a biological organism. So there are a variety of biocides or fungicides that are used in the industry. Unfortunately, if you watched our earlier video series, you'll know that the problem with most biocides is they're ineffective against the spores or the seeds, and they're very rarely label approved to kill the root structures or for use on porous substrates. And folks, all of the surface of the boards on the underside of the attic sheathing is porous. And the root structures that are embedded in this wood go deep into the wood. The roots will typically penetrate some 3/16 of an inch into the wood, driving deep and grabbing the feed. And these mold roots are very similar to plant roots. They establish a network and feeder ways, and they feed this mold that's growing on the surface of the board. So what we see on the surface of the boards is the pigment that the mold uses to protect itself from sunlight, and then the spores that are gathered together, which can be released into the air. And killing these root structures that permeate this 1/2 inch or 3/4 inch thick piece of plywood is really the most important part of the mold remediation protocol. So the spray and spray paint techniques involve spraying or fogging a chemical poison-based biocide on the wood, and then after that's done, coming back through with a spray gun and applying a paint spray coating on the bottom. This spray paint coating they call an encapsulant. So the folks that do this don't call it spray painting, they call it encapsulating. And folks, the encapsulation technique actually came from the asbestos industry. And yes, I was actually a certified asbestos worker all the way back in 1987. And I did asbestos when it was a requirement that the states were requiring the commercial buildings that had asbestos in public places to remove the asbestos. And we used to go into these buildings and get rid of the asbestos. And everything that we do in the mold industry was really originally borrowed in protocol format, pretty much broadcloth or wholesale, from the asbestos abatement industry. So the encapsulation or spray painting technique came about in the asbestos world when the cost for removing that asbestos skyrocketed out of control so that all the state-owned buildings had to get it done. And the costs were so astronomical, it was really burying the state governments and the local governments in terms of costs. So they decided to weaken the protocol, and instead of requiring that the asbestos get thrown away, they allowed asbestos that was considered to be non-friable or not crumbling to stay. And then they would spray a coating of a lacquer base on the asbestos, and that would trap the fibers from the asbestos so they wouldn't go airborne. So the theory behind the spray and spray paint technique is that you're trapping all of the spores underneath a coating of a poisoned or mold-proof paint. And it sounds great in theory. So they say we just spray on the chemical to kill the mold, and then we spray on the mold-proof paint to keep or encapsulate, to lock that mold down so it can never grow again. And folks, unfortunately, I have retreated more of these spray and spray paint jobs than Carter's got liver pills. And the reason I had to do that has to do with our former discussion of dew point. So there are several problems with the spray and spray paint method. The first is it's a dead giveaway that there has been a problem in an attic when you have got an encapsulant in the form of paint on attic boards or wood. Well, what do I mean by that? Well, there's only two things that causes an attic to be painted. The first is a house fire, in which case they're spraying a paint to lock down the smoke smell. And the second is mold. So, they're both bad things, and they will affect your resale value when it comes time to sell the home. So we do not want to use the spray and spray paint method. Now here's another reason, and it's the principal reason that this is bad. This is a cosmetic reason it's bad. Now it does cover up the stains, so it eliminates a lot of the work that the average mold remediator has to do to get rid of the pigment in the wood and make it look mold-free. But what it does is it leaves this paint on the inside surface. Now folks, latex-based paints form a vapor barrier, and that is the problem with this technique. Because what happens is in between this vapor barrier in the cold boards of the roof, when you put a vapor barrier up against the cold boards of the roof, when you get condensation in the future, it starts to build up between the wood and the paint film. And in that area, as that moisture builds up, you get a delaminating effect. You can see pictures on our website of this paint coming down in big flakes, and actually mold growing on mold-proof paint. Now, it isn't feeding on the paint. If the paint's poisoned, the mold can't survive on it. What the mold can do, however, is that mold can feed on dust and live on top of the paint. Now, it's a meager existence for mold. It's laying on a sticky enzyme layer, just capturing particles from the air, so it doesn't really thrive. But yes, we have seen attic mold jobs where the mold grew back and was growing on top of the mold-proof paint. So it creates a vapor barrier moisture effect. Is reason number 2. And reason number 3 is an offset of reason number 2. And reason number 3 is when you've created that vapor barrier coating on that paint, if you don't dry out the boards completely, and you lock it in with that moisture-proof coat of paint underneath the attic board surface, what happens is you trap the moisture that's in the wood. And if the root structures have not been killed, and remember we said 90% of the biocides do not affect the root structures. So what happens is you've now trapped moisture in the wood. The root structures are locked in. They can't feed on the surface, so they drive the roots deeper into the wood, and you get that decay of the boards from the inside out because that paint has locked the moisture in as a vapor barrier. It's only going to last through the winter months because it'll dry out enough in the spring and summer for it to not grow. But that's enough time to do serious damage, and it's another reason why the paint or spray and spray paint or encapsulation technique is no good. So it doesn't kill the roots. So in just a few seconds, we'll show you the rest of the techniques, but that concludes the spray and spray paint section. So the next thing that we're going to talk about, the next method of treating attic mold is what I'm going to call the sanding approach. And the sanding approach includes soda blasting, dry ice, and hand sanding. So, the soda blasting, the dry ice, and the hand sanding approach. Well, these are approaches that are touted by some of the people that are in the mold remediation industry. And they talk about soda blasting and dry ice in particular as if it were a mold remediation technique. But folks, I'm here to tell you, it is merely a cosmetic or stain removal technique. And in order to understand that, you've got to understand mold and how it grows. So, the first thing you need to understand is that when mold grows on the underside of a board, this is a board that we've blown up in cross section. So we're going to call this the inside of the attic right here. When mold is growing on the surface of this board and you shoot, so first let me explain what soda blasting or dry ice blasting are for those folks who don't know. In soda blasting or dry ice blasting, you have your worker up in the attic, and he's on his hands and his knees, typically, working to treat this mold problem. What they do is they take a gun and high pressure air, and they shoot baking soda at really high pressure at the wood, and they abrade the surface in 2-inch swaths. Or they can take ground up dry ice and do the exact same thing where they're shooting the dry ice at the boards. So this technique is often called bead blasting, soda blasting, and it depends on the media that's being shot at the board. But what it does is it starts to literally abrade the surface. Now, the reason this is not a mold remediation technique and that it's just a stain removal technique, folks, is that the roots of the mold, remember, are growing 3/16 of an inch into that 1/2-inch board. And that 3/16 of an inch, if you hope to remove the mold, you've got to take that board down 3/16 of an inch past the root layer. And they are not doing this, folks. What they're doing is they're taking off the first 32nd of an inch because it's in that layer that the pigment or the coloring from the mold exists. So they'll take their blaster and they will take the sand blaster and they'll blast away the pigment layer so it looks like the mold is gone. But in reality, what they're still doing is leaving the majority of the root layer intact. Now folks, if they took that, which they could with dry ice, all the way down to 3/16 of an inch, what you'd have is structurally compromised attic, because the roof boards would no longer be able to support the snow weight. And the 2x4s that are making up the rafters would no longer be 2x4s. And so what they're really doing is they're erasing the pigment layer of the mold so that to the naked eye it appears to be clean wood. Now, could you use soda blasting or dry ice in conjunction with a secondary methodology to solve a mold problem? Well, yeah, you could. And in fact, we do use soda blasting as a all green or non-toxic stain removal technique. But we're talking about sanding, soda blasting, dry ice, or hand sanding being used as a mold remediation technique. And folks, that it isn't. The reason it's not is it does not take the wood deep enough to get to the roots. It removes the pigment only. And that means it leaves the roots of the mold intact. And leaving the roots intact means leaving the mold problem. Because folks, it's the roots that are the real body of the mold organism. So much like with a dandelion that grows in your yard, you can lop the head off that dandelion week after week with your lawnmower. And you know that if you don't get that taproot, folks, next week when you mow, there'll be a new dandelion. You can do it over and over again, week in and week out. Mold is a lot like a dandelion. It's the root structures that sustain the plant that cause all the enzyme reactions that break down the wood and feed the mold. So, the sandblasting and soda blasting techniques do have a cosmetic effect. They will abrade that pigment layer, the top 32nd of an inch of the wood. But what they leave beneath that's invisible to the eye are the root structures. So, is it all right? It's an okay stain removal technique. But it's no good for using as a treatment for mold remediation. It is not a mold remediation technique. It's a stain removal technique. I'm Charles, and in the next segment we will go over the third mechanism. Hi folks, it's Charles again. In this segment we're going to go over the third technique that's commonly used. This is actually less common than the other two for treating attic mold, but it is a technique, it does exist, and someone might be doing it in your marketplace. And this technique is what I call the bleach technique. And in some cases, the bleach and ozone technique. So, what's the bleach technique? Well, again, we're going to go back to my horrible attic drawing. And in the bleach and ozone technique, you send a worker, again, up into the attic, on his hands and his knees usually, and he holds a spray wand of some sort, and they go over the wood and spray it with a bleach to erase the staining off the bottom of the wood and to make it look clean. And folks, one of the biggest misconceptions in the mold world, and that one of the biggest misconceptions on websites and on the internet about how to treat mold, is that bleach is effective for killing mold. So again, I hate to go back to this again. This is a section of the board of your attic in cross section. The roots of the mold are penetrating 3/16 of an inch into the wood. We're going to call this the attic side again. So you've got these roots that are penetrating from the surface into that wood substrate. Now, bleach, folks, it has an ion structure that prevents the chlorine from penetrating a porous substrate. So it prevents penetration of the porous substrate. What does that mean? Well, it means that the bleach sits on the surface of the wood. What it does a great job with is erasing the pigment layer, which is again the top 32nd of an inch on the surface of the wood. And what's left behind is apparently clean looking wood, but it still has viable root structures within it. And again, going back to our dandelion analogy, folks, if you really want to kill the mold, much like wanting to kill a dandelion, you got to get that root out to destroy the dandelion. To kill the mold, you've got to get rid of the root structures. So the companies that do this, they do it because they can get in and get out. They get in and they spray the attic down with a powerful bleaching oxidizer. There are some professional ones like MMR or some other household names, or they just use a strong oxidizing chlorine agent. And what they're doing is they're bleaching the pigment layer off the surface of the wood so it looks like clean wood. And now the smart ones, they then set up ozone generators in the attic, which takes and converts the air in the attic to a powerful gas. And that ozone gas will kill the spores in the attic, and it'll break down the smell of the bleach, because folks, it's not pleasant having someone work with bleach inside the attic in your home. So the ozone will destroy all of the toxic chemicals associated with the bleach, and it will kill the mold spores. And so you're left with an attic that looks clean. This is done all the time at point of sale when one homeowner is buying and another homeowner is selling, because it's a cheap way to go about it. And when it's said and done, it's clean, it doesn't smell like mold anymore, and you think that the problem is gone. And you know what? Until the following winter, you usually don't find out that it isn't. Because what it does not do and will not and cannot do is penetrate and kill the root structures, and that's because the ion structure of chlorine prevents penetration of the chlorine portion into the substrate. But you know what it doesn't prevent? It does not prevent the penetration of water. So the H2O or water portion of the bleach will go in and water the mold roots. So it does a great job of making the mold look like it's gone until it builds up a new pigment layer. But in reality, what that water is really doing is it's going into the wood and feeding the mold while the chlorine sits on the surface and breaks down the pigment. So the chlorine never makes it to the layer of wood where the roots are, and what you've got at the end of this job is more mold. So the bleach and ozone technique is another bad technique for treating mold in your attic.